A friend pointed out that my introductions to the magazines in India, as I knew it, so this is very personal and it's very opinionated and it's a very subjective matter. But he said that it was random and all over the place, and it was about it started with winter and how one could not walk in winter today because it's very cold, and went on to a time when we could just walk everywhere and in a place called India, go buy magazines or what have you. And it came to how we used to be very active and play a lot of cricket, which is possible even today, but except it's not possible right now, today, as in, in 2020, because it's cold, it's winter here. But it's subjective history. Sometimes it is calligraphy or embroidery or, you know, a mosaic, if you will, of lots of stuff that makes life interesting. And at the end of the day, my channels are more recording of history than to I mean, I'm not actively trying to get people to subscribe or things like that. It's just not my motto. So let's get on to the subject, because a lot of complaints, well, only in the last one the complaint was that I don't come to the point. So the point is magazines in India. My first memory of my first magazine that I ever saw in my life was called Chanda Mama, and my mom had brought it home. I think she must have paid what is equivalent to 5 paise, 25 paise at that time, and the magazine itself cost 1 rupee 50 paise. And she bought a copy of Chanda Mama, and she was hoping to instigate an interest in me in reading English from storybooks, and that would help me learn English, and it worked. And since then I've read a lot of comic books, Indrajal and Amar Chitra Katha, including the amazing Jataka tales and Tintins and Phantoms and Mandrakes, and but those are not magazines. But Chanda Mama was a magazine, and the first night she had brought it, I was just looking at it and I asked my mother for help, and my mom says, "No, you read it." And I didn't know what to make of it because I was just 5 years old. But that attitude of my mother gave me a lot of things in life. And sometimes what your parents do for you, or even when I see my friends as parents and what they do for their children, might not be immediately visible. But when they're gone, you remember the little things that they're done to make you who you are today. So the first magazine I saw was Chanda Mama, and it was a very bluish magazine with very limited colors, and it was beautiful. And then Chanda Mama became colorful, but the latest edition that I saw of Chanda Mama in 2000 is horrible. It's too colorful and it's basically senseless. And Chanda Mama was available everywhere. Everybody seemed to have Chanda Mama because it was not a comic book. It was the equivalent of writing with a fountain pen. In our school days, nobody allowed us to write with a ballpoint pen, which was called ball pen. And trust the Americans to call it ballpoint pen, just to make it very clear. But the ball pen that we used to use our teachers did not allow us. They asked us to use the Indi pen, which was, originally the Indi pen was nothing but a feather that was dipped in ink. But luckily now we had a nib and shell park and all those Camlin and amazing inks, and sometimes we mixed inks, black and blue, to give it that deep color, or sometimes got the light blue, depending on our mood. As I've changed the logo of my Churchgate 615 to blue, because it's a much more cooler concept we are dealing with now, and it just depends on the mood and the color changes. Anyway, so Chanda Mama was the first magazine I saw. And then my uncle, that one of my aunts married, Kishori Masi, he used to write for magazines, Mirror, and magazines that I'd never heard of before. Magazines like Mirror and Outlook and this and that. And then my friend who commented about my lack of coercive, lack of clarity, worked in Lana Publications. Now, Lana, when he started working in Lana Publications was at its zenith. Okay, so it had come out with a magazine called Island, so that Island could counter Bombay magazine. And then it had a magazine called Parade, which was not really a competition to Reader's Digest, because Reader's Digest was like Wendy's Burger. It was much more classical. But what Parade did, and Parade was one of my favorite magazines, and I used to read it in Murli's house, and it collected the best articles of around the world. And it gave you, and that gave you a sense of, I mean, suddenly you became a world player. There was a program called World This Week before Pranav Roy became very political and got funded by politicians. The World This Week was a very interesting program because we got to see the world. And nothing gave us greater pleasure than being able to see the world. So Parade was great, Island was boring, and then they had a few film magazines like Showtime and Stardust, which was, of course, very, very famous. Shobha Day was the editor, you know. And then, it had Neeta's Natter, which was probably Shobha Day's work. Very catty. And Lana Publications gave us some good magazines. I think when Murli was working and they had their printing press in Kandivli, headed by some Sharma guy who borrowed his hair from one side of his head to the other side. They used to publish as many as 8 to 10 books, and people will clarify what I'm saying. But yeah, Island and Showtime and something that sounded like Society and Savvy and all those kind of magazines. And then suddenly Narihira came into making movies, and you had Aditya Pancholi, if I'm not mistaken, come into all these video movies that were made. So yeah, magazines went away when the movies became video movies, because then suddenly all these movies were much more accessible. And then of course you had Star Plus, the channel jump in, which was a very general English channel before it diversified. So you had MTV, ESPN and Stardust. So you had Star Plus, you had Star TV, and you had ESPN to start with. And then of course you had MTV that jumped in, and Channel V, which came out of MTV, and suddenly magazines were gone. But before that, magazines were very interesting. There was a guy called Murli who used to live on the second floor. He was a tall person, and he used to study in Don Bosco Matunga, because I've seen him wear a t-shirt, and I'm talking about Anand Society. And once I went to retrieve a ball, and they had a collection of Illustrated Weekly, and I'm telling you, Illustrated Weekly was as good as life was, because it was full of pictures and it was amazing. So, and then I think my grandfather had subscribed to Reader's Digest, and we had Reader's Digest come in, and then it would have word of the day, and humor in uniform, and all kinds of stuff that made us who we are. So magazines in the 70s and 80s, even early 90s, was very big business. And then CNN came, and the war came, and then everything, all the news that you had to get, started coming on television. So today, if I want to know what's the latest thing that's going on in the world, I'll check YouTube, okay, or BBC Radio. But there was a time, and I just saw a small documentary about New York, and there was a time when magazines and radios ruled the roost. I loved those times. I'm sentimental about those times. I'm nostalgic about those times. And I feel that those were the best times, when you could just close your eyes and listen to the radio. And you can still do that, but that sincerity is gone from the medium. And the magazines, the journalists that fought for the truth once upon a time, it was a different world we live in. Okay. And of course, I saw Cosmopolitan and Dolly, and it's not very difficult to see them, because I bought my first sports magazine, and this is where my other friends would come in, from a shop which was next to an Udupi restaurant in Juhu Lane, bang opposite the gate of Kailashpuri. And there was there was a guy who used to sell vegetables, and next to him was a waste paper mart. And I bought my first sports magazine, which had Barry Richards and Sunil Gavaskar and all the cricketers, pictures, sometimes posters. We used to have Sun and Weekender magazines, which had posters of Bruce Lee. uh, you know we bought them for the posters, can you believe it? And sometimes they would have songs, lyrics from the songs. It's just magical, the world we lived in. And I bought Barry Richards, was some South African that I didn't know, but suddenly I saw color pictures. And because we used to watch all these cricket matches in black and white, we had no idea how colorful, how red the soil was and the pitch was, and how green the grass was. And of course they saturated it a bit like I do, but it was a different thrill altogether. And then of course I had my friends who regularly bought, and that's what my friend Umesh reminded me, that we used to just go to the bookstore. So there were two bookstores near where we lived. There was one that was opposite at the entrance of Lallubai Park, you know, which had all these teenage magazines sometimes and Tom Cruise posters. And it was a bookstore next to Panwala. It was just outside Lamor as you went towards Lallubai. And we got to see our first Tom Cruise poster from that movie about the airplane fighters, Take My Breath Away movie there. And then if you walked ahead, then there's a bus stop, an 84 number bus stop, a 4 limited number bus stop, and you could buy your Sports Star. And Sports Star was not the only magazine. Of course they came out with a magazine on cricket, but by that time it was too late, because then Cricket Info came and Crick Buzz came, and those were our online magazines. And we would just go and look at pictures. And this too, Sanju and Umesh, sometimes even they bought, sometimes one bought it and the other times the other bought it, and they would exchange it or something or the other. They'll get to know the latest news. And then they came out with Tinkle. I think the Chanda Mama guys came out with Tinkle, because then Uncle Pai, as he was called, the guy who who was the editor of Amar Chitra Katha, suddenly decided that he should come out with Tinkle, and somebody came out with Champak. But I tell you that Chanda Mama, the quality of Chanda Mama, my first look at Kerala before I saw it in my friend's wedding was in Chanda Mama. When you saw Chanda Mama, you knew what Kerala looked like in the olden times. I think that's a very good place to leave this, but it has been a magical journey. Thank you for listening.